Welcome back to Sex and Space. I'm Toshi, and today we're excited to be bringing you a conversation between Tim and Dr. Brian Willoughby, who is from the School of Family Life at Brigham Young University. Their discussion today looked at how to talk with kids about porn, so let's jump into the episode.
Dr. Brian Willoughby is a professor in the School of Family Life at Brigham Young University and a research fellow at the Wheatley Institute, internationally recognized expert on couples dynamics, marriage and sexuality, with over 100 peer-reviewed publications, research on adolescent pornography habits, and the impact on relationships has been widely cited in major media outlets like the New York Times, USA Today, and the Washington Post. Today he's here to help us navigate the tricky but crucial conversations parents need to have with their kids and teens about pornography. Brian, welcome to Sex and Space. Thank you very much for your... Thanks ever so much for your precious time. Really, really important conversation that I think, it's out there. It's starting to sort of trickle through. Like you said, the media are sort of picking up on this, and your voice and others are out there. But really, really interested. I think a lot of people are slightly flummoxed by this conversation. A lot of what I hear is that parents, particularly of my age and similar, I don't know if you've got kids as well, but we're one of those first generations where our childhoods and upbringings and exposure to pornography is radically different to what our children are currently going through now. So I think we're upskilling, for the sake of our children. So I think that's really interesting, and hopefully we can get some really good insights and tips and tools from this conversation. But yeah, really, really happy that you're here. Love to kick off with what you do and how you got into it. If you'd like to give us a brief overview on that one.
It's a question I get a fair amount of. How did you get into studying pornography? It's certainly not something as I started my schooling and went to grad school that I thought this was where I was going to end up or spend a lot of my time. My background's actually in healthy relationships. I started in my graduate studies focused on understanding healthy marriages. That's what I was really interested in as a grad student, as a student in college at the university, is what makes healthy marriages happen. Why do some people get divorced? And it was during graduate school that I actually really started to get fascinated with the step before that for a lot of people, which is what is happening during the teenage years, during young adulthood in particular, that is influencing what happens in terms of your relationships. Why do some people get married and other people don't? Why do some people end up in happy marriages and other people don't? And what's happening, like I said, particularly as we're growing older, during the teenage years and through the 20s, that impacts that. So that's really where my career started, is focusing a lot, and I still continue to focus a lot on young adults, adolescent dating patterns, dating behaviors, attitudes and perceptions about relationships. But I've also been interested in that context of what are the modern factors in our world that really influence that process for young adults and teenagers. And that's where I started by doing a lot of research on just sexual behaviors and risky sexual behaviors, because that's always been kind of an aspect of the dating process, is how do you navigate sexual intimacy as you move through those kind of first serious or maybe not so serious relationships. But it became very apparent, and this was, starting about 20 years ago, where right about at that time, the smartphone came onto the market. As you mentioned, pornography in terms of its consumption and how it was consumed online started to change dramatically. And it became pretty clear to me as I was doing surveys and interviews with young adults and teens that pornography was something they were trying to navigate and trying to figure out. And the prevalence of it, the frequency of use and how common it was shifting. And so for me, this became a focal point of my research to understand, again, not just what's happening and what are the effects of pornography. And I've done research on both those things, but really, again, backing into that context of how does this influence that trajectory where most young adults and most teenagers still at some point want a stable, long-term, lifelong relationship and a family. How is pornography intersecting with some of those hopes and dreams and relationships? So that's where I kind of came into it, and still remains, like I said, one of my primary focal points is to really understand how is this impacting not just individuals and not just teens and family dynamics, but really with an eye towards relationships and healthy relationship formation during that time.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, it is a tricky subject, pornography, and so it's kind of one that people might sort of by its nature avoid talking about, or addressing, or upskilling on, particularly parents. And I think that some of the reasons there that it is prevalent, and in the earliest sort of stages of childhood as well, like that. I think it was about 12, right? Is the average age that kids are exposed.
Yeah, typically between about 10 and 13 is about average.
Yeah. Can we just touch on why that is? What are some of the reasons that a young child like that is being exposed to it? I'm sure there's multitude of reasons.
Certainly you've got a wide range of reasons, just like with anything. And there are certainly some young kids that do seek it out, that hear about it and, search on the internet and things. But you're right in the sense that the vast majority of young kind of preteens that are exposed to pornography have that first exposure that's unintentional or accidental. And I actually think an important contextual factor here for parents to understand goes back to something you referenced at the beginning, which is to understand the shift that's really happened in pornography access. And this is something I have to remind parents that are my age in particular, because as you referenced, is I remember growing up when I was a teenager, when I was young, and pornography was mostly contained to magazines or videos, and you go to the video store and there's the back little section that you go into, and a friend might have a magazine that he found under his dad's mattress or something, and you pass it around. And so the kind of, for lack of a better term, the Playboy version of pornography really disappeared in a lot of ways with the advances in the internet, with smartphones coming on the market around 2004. And so because of that, our kids just in general have more access to information across the board. I think that's one thing for parents to really understand, is that as soon as you give your kids any version of technology, whether it's a tablet, a phone, a computer, even a TV, a smart TV, they've got access to a just almost infinite amount of information, both good and bad. And so for parents to understand that, then back to the core of your question, is we know, like I said, the vast majority of kids get exposed to pornography unintentionally. They weren't seeking it out. It's just very prolific online. And not only that, it's oftentimes situated in online spaces to attract as many people as possible. Getting into the ethics of the pornography industry is probably a whole separate conversation. But the reality is that the pornography industry, like most companies, want as many consumers and as many eyeballs on their product as possible. And so, like most companies in online spaces, they create a lot of avenues to kind of filter people into those. And so for young kids, typically the two most common avenues through that are peers and social media. And social media, I think, is one that, again, a lot of parents don't think about. They obviously are maybe concerned about social media. They might be monitoring social media. But I talk to a lot of parents who say, well, hold on, don't most of these major social media platforms, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, don't they have policies that ban pornography or ban explicit sexual content? And the technical answer in most cases is yes. But again, like most industries, the pornography industry has found multitudes of ways to get around that. And if you have a young preteen that has a phone, has social media access, it's not uncommon for them to end up clicking on a link or even clicking on a picture that takes them to a pornography website. In fact, I've got 4 kids myself, 3 older kids. One's a teenager right now. And he actually just a couple weeks ago told me, he's like, "Hey, Dad, I was on social media and I clicked on this ad for LED lights because I'm like, oh, that's cool. Maybe I want that for my room." And it was a false link. It went right to a pornographic website.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty common experience for kids. Is I clicked on this thing, it had nothing to do with pornography, and it took me to a pornographic website.
Yeah.
And then, like I said, peers sharing links, peers sharing pictures, videos, things like that. Those 2 avenues are typically the most common route where kids access pornography for the first time.
Yeah. And so before we sort of talk about the effects, I think that, or at least some of the sort of reactionary responses that a 12-year-old who's seen that, might instinctively have. Do you find that through your research that even though, we need to upskill or navigate this landscape, if we want to protect our kids from seeing this, a better approach potentially is to, foster good relationships with our children. Like you said with your son, he came and told you and talked to you and looked for an explanation on perhaps what he'd seen from you. Is that where you see better outcomes from?
Yeah, I think for parents, it's important to first understand, as we've kind of been talking about, that pornography exposure rates, by 18, 19 are essentially 100% for most kids. And so a lot of parents approach this from a preventative standpoint where they say, okay, if I say anything and if I do anything, because we know most parents don't have these conversations at all, they just kind of cross their fingers and maybe hope.
Yeah.
Most of the time, parents, will put on filters or other parental monitoring technologies and then just assume that will mean that their kids will never be exposed to pornography. But like I said, oftentimes the first step is parents need to understand that it's almost inevitable, that it'll happen. Like I said, I've got 3 kids now that have gone through most of their adolescence or past their adolescent years. All 3 of them got exposed at some point to pornography. And so it really is a when, not an if. And I think that helps because then the conversation can start with kids at all ages of, when you see pornography, here's what I'd like you to do, or here's the conversation I want to start having with you, instead of the if it happens. I think that's kind of step one, because as I'm sure we'll talk more about, having the conversations with your kids is already going to put you in the top 5 percentile of all parents. 95% of parents are doing nothing out of fear, out of uncertainty, out of anxiety, out of a lack of skills and knowledge and information. And so the sad part for me is that we know there's such a small percent of parents that even start these conversations, let alone then have the skills or have thought through that, okay, I'm going to have the conversation, but now what do I actually talk about?
Yeah, I think that's the interesting part, is that upskilling and almost building your own, or at least addressing the subject and interrogating your own thoughts on it enough to actually have an opinion that you share. I mean, if you're talking to parents about this, are there any steps that you would sort of recommend, or is it really down to their personal views on porn?
Yeah. I think I usually have a couple specific things to start with parents. One is to avoid 2 extremes that I see a lot. On the one extreme, typically more conservative religious parents have a fear, and these are usually parents that don't talk to their kids, that, well, if I talk to them, I'm going to put it in their head, I'm going to make them more curious, they're going to seek it out. And then there's no research evidence that that's true. And so we see kind of that error on that extreme. And then I also see an error on the other extreme, which are also parents that end up also not talking to their kids about porn, but oftentimes it's because their mentality is, it's normal, I did when I was younger, they're going to do it when I'm younger, I don't want to know the details, let them live their life. And again, the reality is parents do need to talk. There are important things to be talking about with your kids about pornography. I think there's some, what I might call, objective things to talk about, which means I think you should be talking and discussing with your kids, regardless of how you personally feel about pornography, about some of the risks of pornography use. But then I also, to your point, think that then parents can adapt that conversation based on their own personal views. And tied to that, another really big thing I always stress to parents is, because I get the question a lot, like, well, when do you have the porn talk with your kids? And I always kind of jokingly say, well, you don't have the porn talk with your kids. You have the sex talk with your kids. You should be talking to your kids about sex and intimacy and human intimacy and relational intimacy. And pornography should be one of the many things that you talk about. And the reason that's important to your question about values is I think it's really important to talk to kids about pornography in the context of what your values are when it comes to just sexual intimacy and relationships. And I think that helps parents sometimes get past the moralization of pornography wherever they are on that continuum. Because, for example, if I'm a parent and regardless of how I feel morally about pornography, if I want my kids to have a stable monogamous relationship as an adult, well, then I should probably talk to them about pornography in the context of that hope for them and those values around intimacy. And so I think it's really important that parents integrate those two things and think to themselves, what do I value and think is important when it comes to sex and relationships and intimacy? What are my hopes and goals for my kids when they're adults when it comes to intimacy? And then how can that help me shape the conversations that I want to have with them around pornography?
Yeah, no, that's really good advice. I think a lot of what I've heard about, some of those knock-on effects of early porn exposure is that, they're like, well, great, this is normal, this is how I have to have sex, or this is what bodies are meant to look like, or this is what body hair is meant to be, and all those sorts of things. So addressing those, and I think also the some of the more extreme sex acts which have apparently sort of worked their way into a fairly kind of mainstream space. I say extreme in for my sort of context, but there's a bit of rough stuff. There's maybe some choking, all these kind of things. I think, but yeah, if you were sort of thinking, do I want my child thinking that is intimacy and that's pleasure, for instance, you can walk that back and go, actually, what you're looking at there is the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It's not real. Like, you know what I mean? Is that any helpful analogies on that sort of stuff?
Yeah.
The extreme.
Yeah, I mean, like I said before, the word I like to use for parents is risk. I think it is important when we talk about kids and young kids to talk about pornography use as a risk. It has risks associated with it, but it's important to understand more specifically about what those risks are. So like any kind of risk-taking behavior, whether we're talking about drinking or drug use or anything like that, we can educate them and talk to them specifically about what those risks are and why they should be thinking about it and how they can start making some of those decisions for themselves as they move towards adulthood. And like you said, probably the biggest kind of bucket of risk we see is tied to expectations and attitudes about intimacy. We've got really strong research now that pornography use in general for kind of anyone has an influence on what we call sexual scripting or expectations. And that's, not unique to pornography, by the way. It's most of our media research shows that if you watch any form of media, it tends to influence how you think about things, and particularly pornography, which is, at least portraying itself as kind of real people and in real situations. It tends to have a little stronger effect. But then for kids, often the concern from media scholars or pornography scholars that study teens is that we know that preteens and teens during puberty are particularly influenced by early sexual experiences and early sexual media exposure. And so, basically the idea is because they lack a lot of real world sexual experience, pornography oftentimes can become a very shaping experience for them in terms of their expectations about intimacy. And you hit a lot of the things that I share with parents that are important to talk about. The way I sometimes summarize it is that most mainstream pornography hits three ends, non-normative things. It's oftentimes non-normative looking people. They don't look like your average person in terms of their muscle tone and body proportions. They're oftentimes engaging in non-normative sexual behavior, meaning that they're not engaging in forms of intimacy that the majority of couples out there tend to do on a regular basis. And again, you get really specific there about like, the frequency of orgasm or mutual orgasm and specific sexual behaviors, pleasure tied to sexual behaviors, things like that. And then the third N is non-normative context, is that the intimacy is taking place in a situation that's not normative, whether that's group sex or the context, is not what we typically would see with a typical couple. And so when you put all those together, like you said, you're getting a very non-normative display of what intimacy typically looks like. And then if you add on top of it, probably the bigger concern for a lot of people that you referenced too, which is the aggression and consent problems. We know that the vast majority of mainstream pornography now depicts aggressive acts, particularly towards women. We often know that a lot of pornographic videos have issues with consent, not showing clear consent or verbal consent. And we have research that shows that influences kids, that as they watch pornography, they tend to take on more aggressive attitudes, particularly towards women, or aggressive behaviors and those sorts of things. So that's kind of the big concern that I think a lot of parents need to be talking and educating their kids about. I would add one other quick thing to that, which is starting to get a lot more discussion in my field, which is the potential for pornography to develop into compulsive patterns. And I think that's another concern for kids, is that, again, like a lot of risk-taking behaviors, not most by any means. I mean, we're talking about 80-90% of kids wouldn't develop a compulsive, addictive pattern around pornography. But we do, I think, have enough evidence to suggest that it's a risk for a group of teens. And I do think it's important for parents to understand that for some kids, habitual compulsive pattern of pornography use can start setting the stage basically for what we call problematic pornography use, or PPU. In adulthood, which is now something that the World Health Organization has officially recognized, is a diagnosis. The U.S. hasn't officially acknowledged yet, but I think we're moving in that direction. And I think that's another thing to be talking about, because that's separate than the content issue. That's starting to think about frequency, think about how it's interfering with your schoolwork and your friends and stuff like that. So I think it's another important thing for parents to be thinking about.
Yeah, no, that's definitely something that sort of picked up on a little bit, this in this hemisphere, but I wasn't sure what that officially was in America. But all of this does feel overwhelming in a way. Like I said, I think maybe hopefully if we do a half decent job, our children will be better at this with their children. But it really is an upskilling on us and our generation, it feels to me anyway, versus like you sort of talked about how we grew up. I think porn was stuffed into like a hedgerow somewhere. I think like you said.
And like we said, is the access is very different, the content is very different. I mean, I think a lot of parents have a very small, outside of maybe them being porn consumers themselves, understanding of the tube-based pornography sites that are the most popular ones too, that again, like any video site like YouTube, is based on algorithms, and once someone gets on that site, it's trained to keep feeding you what it thinks you want. And like most social media platforms, then that can be a highly appealing process as a consumer, to say, oh, okay, I clicked on this video and now, there's another one, there's another one. Like I said, different than hey, my buddy found this magazine and we keep looking at the same 10 pictures over and over again. Now I'm talking about any one of these sites having hundreds of thousands of different videos.
Yeah. So now we're all terrified. What do you sort of say, like a don't panic message? I think in terms of, like you said, starting these conversations, is there an age that you would start having or trying to foster even the kind of conversations, like you said, around love or intimacy or relationships and that sort of stuff before you even have to approach porn? Like, how do you sort of start to build those into your family life? And
I think hitting the don't panic piece first, because I do think that's important. I think it is important for parents to understand, and this goes with like a lot of parenting stuff. It's not hard, as I kind of mentioned earlier, to put yourself in the upper echelons of parents by simply doing some pretty basic stuff, just because most parents aren't doing anything.
Yeah.
Really it comes down to two pretty simple things that again are not even specific to pornography. It's monitoring, knowing what your kids are doing, monitoring where they are in online spaces, putting some, pretty simple boundaries in place, and then having open communication with them on a regular basis, not just one conversation, but multiple conversations. When parents do those two things, they monitor what their kids are doing, they have ongoing conversations with them, those kids most of the time are just fine. And so it's not a complicated, you need a PhD in this area to make sure your kids turn out okay. It really is just doing some pretty basic stuff that, like I said, unfortunately, a lot of parents don't do.
Yeah.
In terms of kind of the sequence, I always recommend parents should start these conversations before 10, just because we know 10, 11, 12, 13 is kind of the prime time where exposure tends to happen. And so I think talking to your kids, that's usually a way earlier than parents are thinking. And the key is they don't have to be detailed, explicit conversations. I'm not saying sit down with your 9-year-old and have a detailed conversation about what pornography looks like. But it's connected to what we sometimes call pre-arming as parents, which means you're kind of preemptively arming them and preparing them for situations they're likely to encounter. So it could be just as simple as, like I said earlier, sitting down with an 8, 9-year-old and saying, hey, I want to start talking to you about sex, and here's what sex is. And here's some things I want you to know about sex. I always like parents to start with like, sex is positive and it's great and it's wonderful. And it's going to be an important part of your life someday. And don't worry if that sounds, gross or whatever right now. And again, you don't have to get into all the specifics with them. But then pornography becomes, oh, by the way, there's this thing called pornography, and it's videos and pictures that are on the internet of people engaging in various sexual behaviors. And we're going to talk more about it when you're older, but you're likely to come across it at some point. And oftentimes what I'll focus with parents is your main message there is to let them know that it exists. And two, to say, I want to be the first person that knows. That was my main message with my kids is when it happens, I want to be the first person you come to, so that you open that door, that mom or dad is not the scary person. They're not the person I hide this from. They're the person that wants to know. And I go to them for information. And that way, then as they get into that 10, 11, 12, and you can start to have more specific conversations with them about pornography, you can weave in your values as we talked about before. You can maybe even start asking more specific questions like, have you seen pornography? Have you come across something? What about your friends? You've kind of set that foundation early. The other thing I'll quickly add there that I found with a lot of parents my age and even with my own kids, if you're aware and thinking about this when your kids are 7, 8, 9, 10, more often than not, what you'll find is that the opportunity to have that conversation comes not because you created it, but because it comes up among peer groups. Almost every one of my kids around that age at some point came and said, hey, mom, dad, I heard this word on the playground, or I heard this word at school, or this person, my friend, said this. What is that? And unfortunately, I think a lot of parents, whether it's related to sex or pornography, do we'll talk about that when you're later, which immediately sends the message to kids of, okay, I wasn't supposed to ask about that, instead of using those moments as opportunities to have the conversation that I just said.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that sounds bang on. And I think as well that what you said about sort of you not being the punisher in this, in any sort of potential future scenario, like kids see something, they feel like if they tell you, maybe they're going to have the device taken away, or you're going to come down on them like a ton of bricks. I mean, that's just the opposite to what you actually want to happen, isn't it? But you can see how that could play out. Yeah, absolutely. Where do you see a more formal education kind of fitting in? Only because of the way I sort of visualize it is a bit like a trifecta. Is you've got your friends and your peer groups, you've got the more formal education, and then you've got your parents, and they can all contribute. Is there a space in, I suppose, what you'd call a formal education for anything around this?
Yeah, I mean, I'll get on my soapbox a little bit and talk about a fantasy world that might not ever happen. But for me, like I said about my background, like my background's in healthy relationships and relationship development, and it's always been a frustration point for me that despite almost all cultures around the world identifying that healthy human relationships and romantic relationships are oftentimes at the foundation of so many good things in our world, whether it's the important socialization of kids, labor, economy, just all these things tend to filter down to if people are happy and doing well in their families. That informal education, particularly with kids and teens, we give them almost no resources for how to have a healthy relationship. We teach them math, we teach them science, maybe teach them a little bit about finance, but human relationships, figure that out on your own. So the answer for me is absolutely and again, it's not just about pornography. I think we need to do a better job in formal education of teaching kids basic interpersonal skills, especially in a world where, because of technology, they're struggling with that. We see across the board, marriage rates are dropping, fertility rates are dropping, dating rates are dropping, sexual activity rates are dropping in most parts of the world. Because if you talk to teens and talk to young adults, they struggle to navigate human relationships now. It's not how most of their world, especially their digital online world, is constructed, to have to navigate with another person and deal with another person's nuance. They're very used to on-demand, individual, catered connections and products. And I think, and again, I'll set up another podcast at some point. I'm starting to do some research on AI companionships. Because I think that's going to be a huge thing just in the next 5 to 10 years. But we need to teach our kids about how to have healthy relationships. Part of that then is to teach them how to have healthy sexual relationships. And part of that is to teach them how to have healthy approaches and a healthy literacy about pornography consumption. So I think that's really important. I'm not particularly hopeful that we're going to move in that direction anytime soon, but I think it'd be great. I will add, beyond the formalized education piece, I do think something that's much more achievable that is also lacking is parental resources. Is right now I get asked all the time from parents, whether they hear me talk or other exchanges, like, okay, well, where would you point me? Like, is there a book? Is there other things? And there's some, small books here and there that I think are okay. But by and large, parents just don't have access to a lot of really good resources about how to have these conversations, how to educate themselves about pornography. And I think that's another big missing part right now.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I feel like the culture piece can play a role, particularly, I think the more people that would have conversations like this, and this kind of conversation would do the rounds and people would pick it up. I think that helps. It's not formal, it's maybe sort of a precursor to the sort of parent thing, but also, I think the work I've seen of yours quoted in like the New York Times and stuff like that, I feel like it's creeping out there. Some of the other people I've spoken to would, particularly Ian Kerner, who is a author and sex therapist, he would say probably that pornography has a place in some relationships. I mean, he's a sex therapist. I think he's, would, in the right context, suggest that pornography could be used in a healthy relationship or whatever. Is that really just a values thing?
I think there's a couple kind of intersecting things tied to that. And I do have a lot of sex therapist colleagues that have a similar view of like, I've used pornography as kind of a prescription sometimes for couples for, sexual desire dysfunction or other things. I think there's a couple things to keep in mind. One is, if you look at the research, the meta-analytic research, kind of the studies that we have, we generally see a negative relationship for adults and couples between pornography and satisfaction. And I think that speaks to, on average, couples struggle with it. And I think a lot of that is struggling with the communication piece. I did a study last year looking at just how adult couples navigate pornography in their relationship and the rules and the boundaries they've kind of set up. And what we found, maybe unsurprisingly, is the vast majority of couples have set no rules about pornography and have had no conversations. And so it's one of those things, like most things with intimacy, where it takes good open communication, clear boundaries, ongoing conversations that sometimes are hard for couples because couples just don't have the skills to do it normally. So I think that's one kind of caveat to some of that. I think the other piece that's important to highlight is that oftentimes, one, when we talk about clinical populations, we are talking about something different. Couples that are in therapy, that are working with desire, arousal issues. And so I do think equating what's happening there to just any couple is sometimes problematic. But the other piece, and this is tied to some other research that I did a big report a couple years ago, one of the largest studies of couples in the United States. What we found is that, again, when it comes to satisfaction and happiness and kind of sexual dynamics, it's like I said, the best answer is it's complex when it comes to, is there a place for porn? It really comes down, I think, in some ways to the couple, how they communicate, what the dynamics are like, all those things. Having said that, the one thing we found very consistently, and then there's been a couple other studies that back this up, is that pornography use at the couple level does tend to be linked to less stability overall. And I don't think that's necessarily surprising because, again, back to what we talked about earlier, is even for adults, most pornography that's being consumed, even by a couple, is not typically depicting a lot of long-term, stable, committed relationships. And so even if, from a sexual dynamic and satisfaction and happiness, like, oh yeah, this is spicing up our sex life, it's helping with foreplay, you have those more short-term, maybe positive outcomes. I think what we're starting to see in the research is that, but if I'm consuming that over and over again, even with my partner, sometimes it might be hard to shake some of the commitment stuff that I'm picking up too. Some of the grass is greener, and well, yeah, my current partner does A, B, and C, but wouldn't it be nice if I had another partner that did, X, Y, and Z with me? And again, we're just barely touching the surface. There's still a lot more research we needed to do, but that's always my slight hesitation of just saying, well, it just depends and people are adults, is because we're starting to see some research that suggests there might be some instability stuff going on. Yeah. I think there's more things we need to figure out there.
Yeah. No, I think that's really interesting because it does. I mean, it's obviously, like you said, it's much further on from the conversations you'd be having with your kids. But I just wondered on the trajectory of the porn conversation. If you're talking to your kids and you're saying it's out there, and you can upskill them and in all the ways we talked about, where you would sort of be wanting to steer those conversations, and is it that porn's great, go hard, but maybe when you want to settle down and write it in.
I think and this ties into some of the other things we talked about too, is I think for parents, right, it becomes this conversation of, like I said, it's about risk. We talked about compulsive addictive use patterns. That is technically a risk. It's a low percentage risk. Most kids that look at porn can develop a compulsive mental health problem around it, but you should be at least aware of it as a parent. And then some of these more long-term relational things, like I said, is we've got research, correlational research that suggests that it is a risk for long-term, maybe healthy relationships. And so on the surface, I guess the simplest answer I share with parents sometimes is like, well, if you're really risk averse with your kids, if you want to say what's the best possible chance based on what we know right now of them having long-term healthy relationships as an adult, then in my opinion, it's probably avoiding pornography. That's what we see in the adult research, is couples where both people avoid pornography tend to be, on average, the healthiest and happiest and most stable. Does that mean that there's couples that look at porn together that are super happy and stable? Of course. Again, it's social science research. It's law of averages. But I do think understanding that and the substance connection sometimes I'll make with parents is alcohol. Because again, with alcohol, you've got a wide range of values and thoughts from parents about kids. But we know that alcohol's a risk. Some kids will develop alcohol addiction based on early exposure to alcohol. Some will have negative physical and relational effects on their behavior and parenting. But there's also a lot of people develop and be very responsible with alcohol. Yeah. And so some parents are like, I don't mind if my 15, 16-year-old has a glass of wine and things. If that's where parents what's the healthiest thing for kids? Avoid alcohol completely. That would be the safest thing. But I think parents can take the information they have and they can say, hey, I understand the risks of giving my kids a little bit to drink and sharing a beer here and there, and I've decided I'm okay with that risk. I think if we view pornography the same way, that it's a risk, there's a variety of risks, parents need to understand those risks, assess them, and decide how they want to approach them, then they can make more informed decisions.
Yeah, I think that's a really good analogy because, I think everyone understands, that if there was a diagram of, your average alcohol kind of consumption over time, your college years, it might sort of spike, and then you don't want to keep it at that level. You can come down. In terms of the research that you've done, whether you can sort of speak to this or not, but the benefits of having these conversations with your kids, what are you seeing in terms of, outcomes and stuff like that? This plus, like you sort of talked about other good quality sex education, the kind of outcomes that you can sort of expect from that. What would you sort of?
Yeah, I guess I want to start kind of broad actually, because again, kind of tying this whole topic to kind of larger things. I actually think one of the best benefits of having these conversations with your kids has nothing to do with sex and intimacy. It has to do with just improving your relationship with your kids. This is a topic that can be stressful for them. It can be slightly awkward, but if you can show them on a topic like this, that you're caring, that you're open, that you're honest, I think there are benefits to your relationship with your child. They're going to have dividends in really all aspects of our life. They kind of translate that. So for me, this is a topic that's just kind of a nice parenting opportunity to develop some really great things with your kids that are really going to help you in a lot of other ways too. But beyond that, I think the main takeaway is it's really the prevention or the lowering of risk. One thing we haven't mentioned yet, but tied to a lot of things we've talked about is probably when it comes to kids and porn, the biggest, clearest risk that we see is a connection between pornography consumption and risky sexual behavior. So multiple partners, early sex, unprotected sex. There's a pretty clear connection between consuming pornography and engaging in riskier sexual behaviors. And so, if parents are having these conversations, like we said before, doing monitoring or having open conversations, typically we see a lowering, at least, of their engagement with pornography, which then would have the byproduct of lowering some of their risks for some of these health-related outcomes tied to risky sex. So that to me is the biggest short-term thing. Obviously, as a relationship guy, I think the benefits we talked about later in life can also be there too. But I think that's kind of the clearest piece for parents. Is a lot of parents, obviously, with teens are worried about unintended pregnancy and STIs and all these things. And they typically don't necessarily connect pornography with those things. But the research connects them. Kids that look at a lot of porn, tend to want to and engage in more risky sexual behaviors. And again, tied like what we said, we didn't bring this one up too, but it's not a lot of condom-based sex in pornography. And so if I'm watching a lot of porn and I'm not seeing a lot of condoms, I'm not likely to necessarily use a lot of condoms in my own relationships.
Yeah. No, I get that a lot. That's good. Those are the sort of outcomes that I would expect, I think, at least in that sort of short term. If there was is there one piece of advice? What's the best piece of advice for parents that you would give, and any resources that you would recommend?
Yeah, I think my number one thing is just start having the conversations. Don't worry about messing up. Don't worry about not knowing how to respond to something. Take all those worries about what you think is going to happen or being unprepared, and just do it. Again, I think what most parents will find is that the conversations, again, are going to be maybe awkward at first. You're not going to have all the answers, but again, is put it in the context of most parenting. Your kids come to you, they ask you questions. You don't have all the answers. Sometimes, you make it up, which I wouldn't encourage in this situation, but you go figure something out, right? You go say, oh, let me get back to you and let me talk and look at some other things and approach it the same way. Again, it's one of those things where I guess there's maybe an analogy with budgeting, right? What's the best thing anyone can do for financial wealth and well-being? Just budget. Most people don't do it. And so it's kind of the same thing. Just start talking to your kids.
Yeah. Awesome. That's really good advice. In terms of resources, are there anything that you recommend, or anyone else that's having good conversations about this people could check out?
Like we said earlier, it's always the hard question. There's not a specific book or resource that I specifically recommend. I think one of the limitations in this space is that most of the websites that have the most resources for parents tend to be on the very conservative side and religious side. So if you are a conservative religious parent, you can probably just, do some quick Google searches of anti-porn groups, and they'll probably have some resources. I can't often speak to how great and accurate they are. But again, just to reiterate and reinforce something we talked about, having said that, I don't think there's a ton of specific resources that parents need. It'd be great to have a step-by-step guide, and I hope we develop those in the future. But really, it's just like we said, figure out what you value, what you think is important around intimacy, where you stand about porn, and just share it with your kids.
Just actually, final question. Obviously, parents talking to their kids is really important, right? And like you said, benefits, adjacent benefits, all that kind of stuff. In terms of talking and reaching out in other ways, like going through schools directly to kids, is that sort of approach one that you would sort of endorse or recommend? I mean, I guess it's different, right? But talking to kids directly, I know there's people out there that take that approach.
Yeah, I think so. And always the concern with that is the concern of moralizing it. Like most things with it. But I think with pornography, back to the digital literacy, porn literacy kind of aspect of this, I think you can do it in a pretty neutral way that simply helps kids understand, the differences between, typical intimacy and what's viewed in pornography, some of the exaggerations, help educate them about, consent, help educate them about aggression. I think there's some pretty neutral things. Both, people across the aisle can kind of agree that, it'd be good to teach kids about this, especially when we know most of them are going to have regular engagement with pornography. I'm certainly an advocate for that. I've worked with different groups here in the United States, in a couple different states to start to try to kind of move in that direction, particularly, app-based, AI-based platforms that can be pretty simple tools, educational tools for parents. Again, I don't think it has to be super complicated. I don't think it has to be super detailed, but I think just a couple resources through some of those formal channels that can reach a lot of people would be a great thing.
Yeah, no, totally. No, I think that's interesting because, like you said, if there's these resources are missing out there, like you said, you're struggling to pinpoint one or two that are absolutely brilliant. It feels like there's a multi-pronged approach actually to getting the information out there. Well, hey, so where can people find you?
Yeah,
so out there and findable.
Yeah, best way to keep up to date with the research I'm doing is just my faculty website. You can find it at byu.edu, or just Google me. I keep my CV updated with research and some of the reports. Wheatley Institute that I'm a fellow with is kind of a public-facing institute that does research a little bit more aimed towards policy stuff. And so we've did a report, like I said, a couple years ago about the impact on porn in couples. We've got one hopefully coming out in the next couple of weeks on AI companionship and young adults. So that's another good resource to look at for some of my stuff. Brilliant.
Yeah. Well, we'll check that out, and maybe we'll loop back in for another conversation on some AI stuff instead. Yeah, that'd be great. Hey, really nice talking to you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks ever so much for what is it over there? Friday afternoon.
Friday, yes.
Friday afternoon. Awesome. Well, have a great weekend.
We really hope you enjoyed today's episode. Before we sign off, we wanted to ask you for your help. Because we talk about sex, we keep getting shadow banned across a whole bunch of social media platforms. And that not only makes it hard for people to find us, but it sends a message that sex isn't okay to talk about. Not only is sex okay to talk about, it's totally essential, because more knowledge equals better outcomes for all of us across a whole bunch of different measures. You can make a difference, and what we need from you is your active support. So please follow the podcast and consider checking out our social channels too: Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, whatever takes your fancy. You can find us at sexandspace.com and click on our social links from there. Help us make sex an okay space. Thank you for taking the Sex and Space trip with us, and until next time, safe travels, and we'll see you on the next intergalactic episode.